big enough to be able to lift this humongous Boeing 767 off the ground. That took a few days, and once the crane came, they attached the aircraft to a ground power unit. The crane lifted the aircraft up, and as the aircraft was hanging in the air, a team of investigators inside of the cockpit had already found the popped circuit breaker in the Alpha 1 position. So they pushed the circuit breaker back in, and then they pushed the alternate extension switch once again. And this time, the alternate extension of the landing gear worked perfectly. So already from the beginning, the investigation team had a very good idea of what had caused this. They went through the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, the witness statements from all of the people that were involved in this, and they come up with the final report. And in the final report, they state that the reason that this accident occurred was the breakage of the Kevlar hose that caused the loss of the central hydraulic system. Then came the fact that the first officer, as he was working with the Foxtrot 6 circuit breaker, did not notice the possibly popped Alpha 1 circuit breaker. And we say possibly popped because there is no indication of when this circuit breaker popped. If it was popped already from the beginning of the flight, or if it happened during the flight, or if it happened as part of the failure, because there's no cockpit indication of a popped circuit breaker. And in this case, in this particular circuit breaker, there was no record of it in the flight data recorder either. So we will never really know at what point this circuit breaker popped, but the fact that it was out when they tried to lower the gear using the alternate procedure was what stopped that procedure from working. There were a few recommendations that came out of this investigation to Boeing. There was recommendations about the change to the non-normal checklist structure, that in case the gear was not extended using the alternate procedure, there should be more guidance to the flight crew on how to proceed. Also, it should be mandatory to install that guard for the circuit breaker panel to make sure that a circuit breaker couldn't be pulled inadvertently, and for the airline to implement the service bulletin that would have protected the hydraulic Kevlar hose in the first place. The aircraft was so badly damaged by the gear up landing that it was not considered economically feasible to repair it, and because of that, this is recorded as a whole loss, as in the loss of an aircraft, but with a very, very positive outcome. And that's largely because of the professionalism of the flight crew when they were flying the emergency landing, and also the great work of the cabin crew and also the passengers in the back of the aircraft. Do you guys know that I have a second channel called Mentor Now? Well, I do, and on that channel I do videos about current events in the aviation industry. I do live streams, interactive content, and I explain things that you might have questions about, pretty much like the old Mentor Pilot content used to be. If you want to check that out, then go up here, check out my latest videos, and please consider subscribing to that channel as well. Also, if you want to continue binge watching incidents and accidents, then check out this playlist. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and if you want to support me and the work that I do on the channel, consider becoming a member of my Patreon crew or get yourself some merch. Bye-bye. A Boeing 767 is on final approach preparing for landing. Inside of the cockpit, both pilots know that in a few seconds they're going to have to land their massive aircraft on its engines and belly. What has led up to this, and could it have been avoided? Stay tuned. A huge thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. The story of LOT Polish Airline Flight 126 actually started almost 11 years prior to the incident. Because in June year 2000, Boeing had started to receive reports from some of its operators that some of their Kevlar hydraulic hoses that were connected to the landing gears had showed signs of earlier than expected wear and tear. This was found to be due to the minimum radius of the hose being exceeded, and they figured out a fix to this. Boeing noticed that if they added a bracket and a new swivel fitting to the hose, that would mitigate the problem. So they sent out a service bulletin to all of its This Airbus A330 is on final approach, but something is seriously wrong. In the cockpit, the pilots are fighting for their lives to try and slow the careening aircraft down, and what has caused this situation is stranger than you would ever believe. Stay tuned. Accidents happen for a variety of reasons, but in almost every case the root cause can be traced back to something very benign. Maybe a small mistake that someone makes, sometimes weeks or even months before the accident. That initial mistake is then always followed by several others, allowing established safety barriers to be crossed in what we now know as Dr. Reason's Swiss cheese model. This is why, to be able to fully understand any accident or incident, we have to go back to the very first thing that put the ball in motion. In this story, that means going back to 2001, to the planning of an extension to the apron on Juanda, Surabaya airport in Indonesia. The original plan was for 10 aircraft stands, which are basically parking spaces for aircraft, to be built next to the existing stands on the airport. But to start with, only stands 5 to 10 had actually been completed. The remaining 4 stands were to be constructed at a later stage, so that last bit of land next to the apron was left unpaved, until a need to expand would eventually arise. Meanwhile, stand 5 to 10 were fitted with what's known as fuel hydrants, basically a grid of underground fuel pipes leading up to each stand. This system enables the aircraft fuelers to just hook up a pump car to the hydrant and then start pumping fuel directly from a centralized tank, instead of having to haul the fuel around in huge fuel trucks. This is very common in larger airports, especially at stands where larger, long-haul aircraft are to be refueled, since they generally need enormous amounts of fuel. Now, the pump trucks, which are used to complete refueling, fill several important functions. Obviously, they provide the pressure needed to suck the fuel from the hydrant and then push it into the aircraft, but they also incorporate a couple of fuel filters, which acts as the last barrier to fuel contamination before the fuel enters into the aircraft tanks. The fuel is pumped through these filters, and the pressure differential between the intake of the filter and the output must be closely monitored, since any increase in that differential pressure might indicate some type of fuel contamination from the system. So, what type of fuel contaminations can exist then? Well, there is obviously a large variety, but the most common one is water, which can enter into the system in various different ways. Either as free water from condensation inside the tanks or an outside source, or as water solved in the fuel itself, which can break out as free water when the temperature of the fuel changes. If there is water contamination, this can then lead to further microbiological contamination in the fuel, like fungi or algae, kind of like the inside of a dirty swimming pool. On top of that, there can of course also be other forms of dirt, pieces of rust from piping and other small contaminants, so these filters are super important. But how will a filter be able to catch water, you might ask? Well, that's a great question, and it will introduce you to one of the big villains in this episode, called super absorbent polymers, or SAP for short. Part of the filters inside of the pump trucks has a layer filled with these little polymers, and their job is to attract any water content in the fuel and then absorb it. When that happens, the SAP powder turns into a type of gel, and it effectively stops the fuel from continuing to run through the filter, increasing the differential pressure a lot and therefore giving a clear indication that the fuel is contaminated. This, by the way, is the same type of polymers that you can find in some variants of diapers. Anyway, about a month before the accident flight, Cathay Flight 780 was scheduled to depart, the work to complete those remaining 4 stands had finally started. This Airbus A330 is on final approach, but something is seriously wrong.
Too low.
In the cockpit, the pilots are fighting for their lives to try and slow the careening aircraft down, and what has caused this situation is stranger than you would ever believe. Stay tuned.